part of your everyday discussion with people, you know, because we have lots of discussions about classic literature with the average everyday American. Well, hello there. Welcome back to my channel. Today, my name's Ashley. Let me introduce myself. Hello, I'm Ashley. Today we will be discussing 10 tips on how to read classical literature. Most of the videos that I saw on this subject give lots of recommendations on what books to start with, and this is not going to be that kind of video. I'm still new to reading classical literature myself, but I guess I have a deep underlying belief that regardless of how hard or not hard a piece of classical literature is, there has to be some tips, there has to be some techniques that can help you read classical literature, even if you're not familiar with it, without needing to go through the quote-unquote easy things, because what's considered easy changes depending on what generation you belong to. So let's get started. Tip number 1, start with classics in a genre that you already know you like. For example, if you do not like romance movies and modern romance books, do not start with Jane Austen. Jane Austen's romances are all about the subtle flirtation cues, and if you hate that stuff in real life, then that is not the place for you to start. On the same theme, if you do not like reading philosophical works, then don't start with Plato. If you want to have a wide variety of books that you read that are considered classic literature, start with the genre that you are most familiar with and you most enjoy. And if you don't read books a whole ton, then maybe consider looking at the movies that you like. Do you like heist movies? Do you like action movies? Then there are definitely classics that move a little bit faster. 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, for example, or The Journey Down to the Center of the Earth. Those are both books that are more fast-paced and more moving than, say, War and Peace, which goes on for pages and pages explaining the history of past things. Controversially, if you really love history and you are a sucker for the movement of things, then maybe War and Peace is a better option for you than a action mystery thriller that doesn't challenge what you want, that isn't as mentally taxing per se as something like Tolstoy. So whatever you currently read and watch, pick a genre or a classic piece of literature that fits that genre. Tip number 2, quadruple your reading time. Whatever length of time you think it's going to take you to finish that classic, give it a ton more time. We have all encountered the circumstance where we've met somebody who has an accent, and you have to both slow down and analyze facial features, you have to analyze hand gestures, you have to repeat yourself multiple times in order to get your points across and to be able to understand them. And reading classic literature is a little bit like reading a book with an accent. It comes from a different culture, a different religion, a different context. And so a lot of the main social cues that we are used to and think are normal and natural are actually a product of the culture that we live in. And we have to broaden our minds and slow down and take things in multiple times in order for us to be able to understand a lot of what's happening in the classic literature. That's not bad, it just requires a little bit more time and a little bit more work. So make sure that you're giving yourself plenty of time to read these works of classic literature. It took me 6 months to get through The Count of Monte Cristo. I could have read every word on every page much faster than that, but I would have walked away with zero comprehension and zero impact on my life. So it's okay to read classic literature really slowly. We get a lot of pride in our society on reading things quickly and fast, and it doesn't have to be. Like there are no book police who are going to come after you if you do not finish this piece of classic literature in a quote unquote satisfactory or fast time period. Tip number 3, some people recommend starting reading modern classics, which roughly translates to reading books written after the 1950s, simply because the context and the culture is more similar to what we currently have now, 70 years later. And if you're not used to reading older literature, it might be a good jumping off point to getting into that. However, I firmly believe that if you're willing to put in a little bit of effort and use resources on explaining things, any time period could be a good time period to jump in. Personally, I found that by studying Shakespeare first everything else was made easier in comparison. So I think you can definitely attack this from both ends of the spectrum. You have to take yourself into consideration. Like, do you enjoy reading modern works of literature? Like, that's great. Then maybe you slowly work your way back in history. Or are you the type of person that's like, I'm going to get the hardest of both first, and then everything in comparison will feel easier. Like, figure out where you are in that spectrum, or pick the middle and pick something from maybe the 1800s that's going to challenge you a little bit, but it's still, like, you can still pick up on a lot of the social cues. Tip number 4, very similar. A lot of people recommend reading a short book as your first classic. This, I think, can be helpful, and it can also not be helpful. There's definitely something to be said for the psychological aspect of it, of being able to read a short book like Animal Farm, where it's maybe 120 pages and you finally get through it and you're like, wow, look at me, I read a classic and I understood it and I liked it and it was powerful. So there's definitely a psychological oomph to that, but also if you feel really passionate about reading a specific book, then it doesn't necessarily make sense to start with a shorter novel. For example, if you really love the play Les Miserables and you really want to read the book, it doesn't make as much sense to start with Animal Farm as it does to start with Les Miserables. So take your own consideration, like take your own interest in consideration. Take your own interest into consideration. There we go. When you're picking out the book that you want. Definitely consider the length, but also don't feel like that has to be the only determining factor. Tip number 5, expect that you're probably going to need to read these books multiple times. And not necessarily you need to, but you may also just want to read them more than once. Most of the time when you're reading classics, the first time through is for basic comprehension of the plot. You miss a lot of the social cues simply because it's a different culture and a different time period. The second time through, you gather information about extraneous facts like character growth, moments that you love, where it places it in society, what political arguments it's making, so on and so forth. This, of course, does not matter as much if your only goal in reading the classic is to just be able to say that you've read it. Technically, I could say, darling, I have read Les Miserables and Moby Dick and War and Peace, and I read them. But the second you tried to grill me on any of those things, you would quickly realize that I'd read it in name only. I can't discuss who the main characters are, what happened in the novel that impacted me. Like, any sort of conversation beyond my ability to say that I'd read it would quickly result in me looking kind of like an idiot. On the flip side, though, it took me a very long time to get through The Count of Monte Cristo, but I really want to talk about The Count of Monte Cristo with people who've read it. And it's disappointing to come across somebody who's read it and not be able to discuss the character growth and change and revenge strategies that the main character Dantes discovers. Like, it's disappointing almost to not be able to discuss that. So it depends on what your goal is here. If you really just want to be able to say, I have read these books, then don't worry about needing to read it a second time through. But if you want to be able to talk about these novels and have conversations about them, then you probably need to plan on reading them multiple times, or at least having a lot of commentary in your mind as you go through it on what's happening and why it's important. Which leads me to my 6th tip, which is to use SparkNotes and CliffsNotes as your best friend. This is not school if you're reading classics for fun. If you are reading classics for school, you can still apply these tips, but you don't have to come up with all of the life-altering, life-changing insights that classic literature can provide all on your own. The second you feel like you're missing something, Google it. We miss out on so much with context, so it's okay to say, I have no idea what I've just read about for the last 3 chapters, and to go and look it up on SparkNotes or somewhere else just to figure out what is going on. Like I said, the first read is just for comprehension and trying to figure out what the story is telling you and why that's important. Some great resources for this that I'll link down below are the YouTube channel Course Hero, Crash Course is another really good YouTube channel, also SparkNotes and CliffsNotes, and you can also go to your library. Like, there's literally a section in the library just devoted to books about how and why classic literature is important. And you can get it specific on topic. You can read tons of literature on Shakespeare and why his plays are important. So there's lots of ways that you can analyze literature without needing to come up with all of the ideas yourself. And eventually, the more that you look at it and the more that you see other people analyzing it, the easier that becomes for you. Tip 7 is along similar lines, and it's a bit controversial, so if this isn't for you, feel free to skip this tip. But this tip is to spoil the plot for yourself. I used to be of the opinion that I didn't want to know the ending of a classic book before I finished reading it, and I would avoid spoilers at all costs. And basically what that meant is that I would read the ending and I would go, I don't even know what just happened here. And then I would go and research it, and then I'd get really excited because I'd understood what had happened, but I wasn't actually reading the novel. And so in order to avoid that and to be able to feel the full impact of the novel, oftentimes I will research the plot and figure out what is going to happen in this novel. And then I go through and I read the novel, and it actually makes me more excited because I know where it's going and I can pick up on clues a little bit easier. I can pick up on context a little bit easier because I know where the scope of the novel is going. If you're planning on doing a lot of rereads, this maybe is not as crucial or as necessary, but if you're only planning on reading the novel through once, I would definitely say spoil the plot for yourself. And if you're really opposed to that idea, then I would definitely follow tip number 8, which is to watch a movie adaptation of the classic. Movies are a great way to figure out the social context of what is happening in classic novels. I definitely tend to read classic literature with a monotone voice in the back of my head when I'm reading to myself. And that destroys a lot of my ability to figure out what kind of social construct and social cues are being given. We often will insert our own social cues on situations that we're reading, because if we know that it's romantic, like the character might be like, she looked at him, but we may not read it as she looked at him. We look at it and we go, she looked at him, right? And that comes across better in a movie setting than it does a book setting, where if you're not catching all of the cues, you might look at that and be like, these people have had no interaction with each other and now they are in love and I do not know what happened here. And sometimes being able to watch the movie is all the difference between being able to understand a certain scene and not being able to understand it. Fun fact, at the library, most children do not pick out classic literature to watch as a movie, so most of these DVDs are in fantastic, fabulous condition. Tip number 9, try audiobooks. This helps for the same reason that watching a movie helps, because the intonation of somebody who has already studied the literature and knows what is trying to be conveyed can be very helpful as you're reading it through. I learned a lot about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by listening to it, more so than I did when I read it through the first time. Part of that was because it was my second time through and I was already familiar with the plot, but being able to hear the intonation helped me realize, oh, this character is mad, as opposed to reading it through and I'm just like, oh, he's just expressing an opinion. Is like, yes, but he's angrily expressing an opinion. And sometimes that little boost is all you need to help you understand the narrative and to fall in love with it. Tip number 10 is to read a classic with a friend. Buddy reads are fantastic. There are so many resources online, or even you can just ask your friend or a loved one to read classic literature with you. It's a great way to generate steam for yourself to continue to want to read classic literature, and it also helps you to just maintain that excitement. And if you are not as excited, you have an accountability buddy to help you finish reading. And just to sum up, here's a quote from Professor Arnold Weinstein that says, "Classic novels are restless creatures, trying out new forms of expression, challenging our views on how culture might be understood and how life might be packaged. What is the shape of experience? How would you represent your own? These books help us toward a deeper understanding of our own estate." I think that's just a good reminder to be patient. These books are literally mementos of different worlds, and diving into them and reading them and seeing what life was like for different humans in different ages throughout the existence of our earth is deeply fascinating to me, and it does require a level of effort and a little bit of work on your part and a little bit of patience. But if you give yourself time and space, classics are definitely something that you can tackle and can become part of your enjoyment level in reading and just part of your everyday discussion with people, because we have lots of discussions about classic literature with the average everyday American. I hope these tips were helpful to you, and if you have any more, please leave them down below, and I will talk with you in the comments down below and in another video. Bye!